What is going on, YouTube people? Neo Cards and Comics here for a double Gemrate video week. Gemrate has blessed us with an end of the year recap, recapping all of 2022 grading data, and I thought it was some interesting stuff, so we would sit down and chat about it a little bit. This will kind of kick off probably the last of looking backwards. I still want to get to some individual sport breakdowns, looking at 1 year charts and graphs for a bunch of different cards, so look forward to that as we kind of finish out the week here. Probably be a Saturday video this week. So let's go ahead and dive into this. First, off the top, what the amount of plastic that sports cards takes up in a year, or at least last year, astronomical. Total graded card market reached 15 million items in 2022, and that's just across the four major companies. That is not including all the fly-by-nights, which in the grand scheme of things probably don't total up to that much when you're talking about numbers this big. We look at these numbers every single month, and it's a whole other thing to kind of look at them on a yearly basis, and it really lays out how dominant PSA is in the space when you see it like this. Now, a couple things to note. So, Gemrate talks about, 15 million items total graded. PSA graded 11.2 million. That's up 45% from 2021. And then you see the rest of the company's numbers there. The two big things to keep in mind here for PSA and for Beckett specifically are we don't know how much of that was backlog stuffed from 2021. So a little bit of an asterisk there. Gemrate doesn't mention that, but I feel like it was at least worth bringing up that a decent, I shouldn't say decent, we really don't know for sure, but a portion of this for both those companies for sure were cards submitted throughout early March or late March 2021, and then PSA shut down. Beckett had a pretty massive backlog that they've worked themselves through. So that does need to be factored in here a little bit. That being said, you fast forward to today, PSA's backlog is clear, and they're still grading over 1 million cards a month, which would put them on a 12 million pace for the year, assuming they keep that up throughout the entire year, and we'll see if that happens as we move throughout 2023. But once again, when you look at this broken down like this, it really shows how much of a stranglehold PSA has on the market. 11.2 million graded overall. And we'll break this down by sport and TCG here in a minute. The CCG group did 1.4 million. It's actually probably a little bit higher than that, as Gemrate notes on here. Their population reports didn't kick in until 2.8 and 4.1, so those numbers are a little off. SGC did just shy of 1 million, and Beckett did 748, just shy of 750,000 cards. But just once again, when you look at that PSA top number and compare it to everyone else, it is staggering. When you break it down in the categories, so here's their sports, 7.4 million in sports cards alone, with SGC coming in second at 920,000, and MISC does include non-sports cards. 635,000 for CSG, and then 507,000 for Beckett. On the TCG side of things, this is where things really get wild. PSA 3.7 million just in TCG and non-sport. I'm sorry, non-sports included over here. That's my fault. Misspoke a second ago. But TCG and non-sport, CCG, or I'm sorry, CGC, 775,000. I'm going to put an asterisk here. I don't know how much it would bump it yet, but Marvel is not yet on the CGC population report yet. That'll be added in at some point in time here in early 2023. So we still don't know exactly how big the Marvel chunk of that is, but we'll get an idea of that once that comes online. Beckett at 241,000 and SGC at 68,000. PSA's TCG number by itself is larger than what all three grading companies graded in total. Let that sink in for a second. PSA did more in TCG than the other three grading companies combined in TCG and sports cards. Just massive, massive numbers. And once again, Gemrate notes here on the side, PSA claims 75% of the market share in the grading space. TCG was the top graded category in 2022. A lot of that was carried by PSA's weight. SGC, it was not their top. Beckett, it was their top. And then obviously the CCG group, CGC, it was their top as well. So interesting to see 3 of the 4 major grading companies, their top category is TCG, Pokemon, Magic. Most of that being Pokemon, probably, if you broke it out between the two. SGC, it's their 100%, their biggest area of opportunity is in that space. CGC, very representative, 775,000. That's 3 times the amount that Beckett has done. That's pretty impressive when you consider that CGC is relatively newer on the block. They've been around a little longer than CSG from a grading standpoint, but to immediately blow by Beckett in the TCG space, that's pretty strong for being a younger company. When you really think about it, I'm going to use the word challenge, and I'm using it loosely. The fact that they did 775,000 and PSA did 3.4 million, that they're like a quarter of that to a third, not quite a third, is kind of impressive when you really think about it. So good on CGC in that space. And once again, that's not including Marvel cards yet. And once again, it continues to be a sore thumb for SGC. It is a huge area of opportunity for them going forward in this year. Can they make inroads? I don't know. I've talked to some people in the TCG space. I think the general sentiment is a lot of people don't like the way that TCG looks in their slabs. So that could be something that, unless there's a slab redesign, they might not be able to make a lot of movement in that space. They could do maybe like a pricing special, might not be a bad idea. You know, they've been doing those $9 things. Maybe roll out a TCG special for a month and see what happens. Get some extra business through the door in the TCG space. Running down these other categories, another note from Gemrate. Basketball did dominate, but slowed down once the backlog was clear. You can see that was PSA's second most graded category, followed by baseball, followed by football. Once again, football always seems to be very popular, but in the card space, not as much as some of the other categories. Now, part of that is it might be a little bit less printed, but of the sports cards, basketball with PSA was number 1, a 300,000 gap to baseball number 2, and then 1 million more basketball cards than football cards were graded in 2022. Then you see soccer coming in, non-sport, hockey. Non-sport actually outdid hockey, MISC, which is like racing and things like that, and then some other stuff down there towards the bottom. SGC's number 1 graded category, baseball. Not surprising. I think a lot of that has to do with kind of their roots in vintage. And also they just seem, I don't know why, I do associate baseball with them when I think of that company. I don't know if it's just because of the vintage stuff and you just think of like vintage baseball and SGC slabs, but I'm not surprised that that is their number 1 leading category. The intriguing thing was that football was their number 2 and basketball was their number 3. Kind of shows, you know, basketball was kind of like the flipper's delight, I guess. Basketball really drove a lot of the market, drove a lot of the flipping market, the resale market, all that stuff. So it's not surprising that PSA would lead in that category because people submitting are probably trying to maximize value because they're mostly evil flippers. And then in SGC, that is not necessarily the case. You see it lead with baseball, which is usually viewed as more of, and I'm painting with a very broad brush here, calm down everybody, more of like a collector sport, followed by football with basketball in last because SGC typically has a little bit of a lower resale value. Basketball is driven more by the flipper market, more likely to use PSA for that extra value proposition. Beckett, a little more evenly spread. Basketball leads, followed by baseball, followed by football, but much closer together. And then CSG, baseball leads, and then football and basketball are basically tied. So it's intriguing that PSA just dominated the basketball category. But once again, Gemrate does note that number dropped off after the backlog was clear. So let's see how this filters out as we kind of move into the following year. And a lot of this might have been driven by that backlog. A lot of people were dumping that ultra modern quick flip NBA product on them in mid 2021 before the shutdown. And that's what at least a portion of these numbers are built out of. Here's a percentage of graded items by era. One thing I want to note here is SGC absolutely dominates the vintage market. 1950s and earlier. 10% of SGC's business came from that segment, absolutely crushing everybody else. PSA only 3.2%, Beckett 0.6%, and CSG 2.3%. I will say I hardly ever, I don't know if I've ever seen a vintage card in a Beckett slab. And even if you move through these older years, the 60s and the 70s, once again, SGC dominates that space as well in those categories. And you move into ultra modern, it gets a little bit more even across the board. SGC and CSG, a little bit bigger percentage of their business from that. PSA sitting more in the 33% range, very close with Beckett. And then it's weird that there's this, and I don't know if it's just because the products were kind of crappy in the 2000s. I find it funny, especially, and this is across the board. We'll use PSA as the example here. 2020s is almost 34%. 2010s is 27%. 2000s, it drops off a cliff. It's just no one grade cards from the 2000s. And then the 90s, you see a spike back up again. And I think it's just a matter of, in the 2000s was really kind of a dead period for cards. It was kind of dominated by Topps Chrome, and, some of the designs were kind of nice, but a lot of them were kind of meh. Wasn't a lot of innovation in the space. In the 90s, we get all the cool classic inserts. There's a lot of nostalgia for that era because when a lot of original card collectors kind of came up in the space. I know I have fondness for that era. When I started collecting in the late 80s, early 90s. So all those 90s inserts, Fleer Ultra, all that stuff kind of sits in there. And then the 2000s is kind of like meh. Other than like LeBron and Curry and a few other guys, there's not a lot of action in the 2000s era. 90s has the nostalgic inserts. 2000s really just have a couple key rookie cards, and that's kind of it. And then you get into the 2010s, a little bit more modern stuff, and then the 2020s, obviously. But I just found that interesting across the board of the 90s and newer. The 2000s is kind of a dead decade for all the sports card grading companies. Obviously, TCG is a little bit of a different story because they don't even begin until the 1990s. So their stuff's a little bit more evenly distributed. So those are the numbers for the year 2022. The big question that I have coming out of this, looking at this, is what does next year's look like? So what are some thoughts and predictions in the comments down below on this? I'll give some of mine really quickly here. The first big thing is can PSA get close to 1 million cards a month throughout the entire year? They rolled out their new pricing. We talked about it briefly last night. Talked about it a couple weeks ago when they fully revealed it. I'm not a fan of their January pricing to start the year. I don't think it's that great, to be honest with you. I think they have a little bit of a mini backlog to work through from the $15 pricing tier. The key question is there enough people in the space, and is there enough demand to fulfill 1 million cards a month? We know that's what they can grade at minimum, and that this is without New Jersey even fully online. So that's question number one. Question number two, as the year ends, we have seen declines in CSG and Beckett on the sports card side of things. Their numbers have slowly declined as we've kind of moved out through the back part of this year. Does that continue into the early part of the year? And does PSA and SGC begin to kind of separate themselves even more than what they already are? Now, SGC had a 10% bump in their numbers in the month of December, but when you really kind of break that down, a lot of that whole 10% was really kind of motivated by that $9 Bowman special. If you cut out that $9 Bowman special, their numbers are much more in line. I think they still would have had a slight increase, but it wouldn't have been as big as it looked on paper. So kind of keep that in mind. So can PSA keep their lead and even pull away? I don't really see anyone running them down. I don't see CSG or Beckett all of a sudden making big strides to take a chunk out of PSA. Hell, I don't see SGC making huge strides to take a massive chunk out of PSA. I think the way that this is going to play out, PSA is going to maintain their stranglehold. Then it's really, if I'm CSG and I'm Beckett, I don't even pay attention to PSA. My goal is whatever SGC is doing, we need to be better than them. Because no one's playing for first place right now. PSA has such a massive lead. They have the new office coming online. They have so much infrastructure. It's going to be very, very hard for anyone to really, really run them down. So I think the key move here is focus on going after SGC for the 2 spot if I'm Beckett or CSG. Don't worry about PSA. Let them do their thing. They're going to do their thing. Compete for second place. Figure it out later. Whatever you need to do to establish yourself. And for SGC, if that's separating the gap even more between yourself and CSG and Beckett, you're not going to close the gap down on PSA. At least not significantly, I don't think. I just don't see it happening. At least not this year. Could it happen over time? Maybe. Maybe it starts to whittle away. And then also, if things continue to shrink and PSA is not going anywhere, obviously, how much pressure does this put on CSG and Beckett specifically as kind of the 3 and the 4 in that ranking? Now, CSG has CGC to support them. And when I mean, and I'm not talking about the comic book grading, I'm talking about the TCG space. CGC is killing it in the TCG space. They're kind of dragging CSG along at this point. And I don't know, once again, the other key thing that we don't know, and I don't think we should stress, I don't think I stress this enough. I talk about it, but I don't know that I stress it enough. People really get caught up in the, oh my God, what is grading company X going to do to survive? Insert whatever one you want there of the big, the 3 that aren't PSA. The thing that we don't know, we see CSG grading 635,000 cards a year. People will be like doom and gloom, they're done. We see this all the time when PSA announces cheaper pricing. This grading company's dead. How are they going to compete? Just because they're not the number 1 or number 2 grading company doesn't mean that they're not profitable. CSG, we don't know the books. They could be turning a very nice profit around at 300 or 635,000 cards a year. We don't know. It could be a huge loss for all I know. We don't know that either. It could be, they could be in the green. And it could be fine. You know, not everyone could be number 1. Not everyone could be number 2. You could be number 3 in a space and run a perfectly profitable company and do just fine. Have nice sustained growth. Nothing crazy happens. You're making a nice whatever percentages that you're making, and everyone's relatively happy. Keep that in mind. That's the part that we don't know when we sit here and speculate and guess on all this stuff. Just because your favorite grading company is 3rd or 4th on the rankings, or you don't like, you know, you're worried about what they're doing because they're so far behind PSA, doesn't mean that they're not a profitable company and they're not very content with what they're doing. Would they all like to move up? Would they all like more business? Of course. But it doesn't mean just because they have a bad month that they're losing tons of money. They could be. Once again, we don't know. But everyone wants to jump to that conclusion immediately. So, interesting year ahead for the grading space. I think we continue to see downward pressure on pricing across the board. I don't think PSA sits at their current pricing for very long. I think they start rolling out some specials and things like that, shaking things up. And we'll talk more. Once again, we'll kind of do, I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole on this. I want to do a state of the grading to start 2023, maybe next week, and just kind of look at each individual company, what makes sense for each individual company, where they're at pricing wise, and kind of where we see things going. But as always, shout out to Gemrate. Thanks for the data. Give him a follow on IG, Twitter, and go poke around on the website yourself. There's lots of fun little tools on there that you could really use to deep dive into various different data points, sets, all sorts of stuff. Great stuff on the old Gemrate.com website. We will catch you guys and girls on the next one. Peace.